Ever feel like you're swimming in information, but not actually uh, reaching the shore of understanding?
Yeah, definitely.
Like the puzzle pieces are there, but they just won't quite click into place.
Exactly. That feeling.
That's the feeling we're tackling today. How do we truly make sense of what we learn? We're going to try and shortcut you to that aha
Yeah,
moment.
exactly. It's not about just, collecting facts. It's about building a real, usable understanding. And that's what our deep dive is all about today.
Today, we're digging into a fascinating piece of research. Logan Vierella's article, Making Sense of Generative Learning, published in the Educational Psychology Review back in April 2023.
A really key paper.
So think of our mission as understanding how your brain actually takes new information and makes it its own. We'll look at some really promising learning techniques, but also, where they can sometimes fall short.
Right, the nuances are important.
So by the end of this, you'll hopefully have a much clearer idea of how learning really sticks. Okay, let's jump right in. Fiorella talks a lot about something called generative learning.
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
Okay, so generative learning, at its heart, it's about actively working with new information.
Actively working.
Yeah, it's not just passively absorbing it, but actively, organizing it in your mind and connecting it to what you already know.
Oh, okay.
Imagine you're building with Legos. You're not just looking at the bricks, right? You're fitting them together to create something new. That's the essence of generative learning. Whitrock talked about this way back.
So it's like our brain doesn't just take in new stuff as is, it actively tries to link it to what's already there.
Precisely. And what's really interesting and kind of concerning maybe is that when we're faced with new material, whether it's text, pictures, or examples, our brains don't always automatically do this deep connecting work.
Really? You'd think it would.
Well, yeah, but research by Fiorella and Mayer and others shows that we can often read words or see images without truly processing them in a way that leads to lasting understanding.
Right, it's easy to just skim something and think, yeah, I got it, but not really.
Exactly. It's like glancing at those Lego bricks without actually trying to build anything. And that's where generative learning activities, or GLAs, come in. Fiorella and Mayer discussed these back in 2015.
GLAs. Huh.
These are deliberate actions we can take to really understand the material. It's about moving from just looking at the bricks to actively trying to fit them together.
Okay, so these GLAs are like the instruction manuals for building that deeper understanding. What kind of activities are we talking about? Like, give me some examples.
Sure, Fiorella and Mayer initially identified 8 key ones. Think about things like summarizing what you've learned in your own words,
A summary.
creating visual maps to show how ideas connect, even just picturing the concepts in your mind.
Imagining it.
Yeah, or self-testing, quizzing yourself, explaining the material as if you were teaching it to someone else.
Oh, the Feynman technique kind of thing.
Exactly, that idea. Or even physically acting out the concepts, if that makes sense for the topic, like with science processes or something.
That totally clicks. I
Mhm.
can see how actively doing those things would force you to really grapple with the material, not just passively receive it.
Absolutely. However, and this is a really important point for you to keep in mind, these GLAs aren't some kind of magic bullet.
Ah, okay. There's a catch.
Well, yeah. Their effectiveness really depends on a few things. Who the learner is, what they're trying to learn, and crucially, what kind of support they're getting.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah,
Definitely not going to work the same for everyone every time.
definitely not. For instance, research by Fiorella and Zhang suggests that if you're struggling with a topic, you might need more guidance when using these activities. You can't just throw someone into self-explaining complex physics, right?
Right, you need some support.
And similarly, other studies like Bobek and Tursky and Fiorella and colleagues found that certain GLAs just naturally work better in some learning situations than others. Drawing might be great for spatial concepts, maybe less so for abstract philosophy, perhaps?
Makes sense. Context matters.
Exactly. And some research, like Broad's work, indicates that certain GLAs might not be as effective for younger learners. Maybe their cognitive abilities aren't quite ready for, say, complex concept mapping.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So we have these potentially powerful learning tools, these GLAs, but we need to be smart about how and when we use them.
Precisely.
Now, Fiorella then talks about some of the existing ways we've tried to understand how learning happens, right? Like these frameworks called SOI and ICAP.
Yes, exactly. These are two influential frameworks in the field, sort of the predecessors. First, there's the Select, Organize, Integrate, or SOI framework. Fiorella and Mayer again.
SOI. Select, organize, integrate.
Okay. The core idea here is that to really understand something, you go through three main cognitive steps. You select the most important information from what you're seeing or hearing.
Filter out the noise.
Right. Then you mentally organize it in a way that makes sense in your mind and your working memory, that limited mental workspace.
Building a structure.
Yeah. And then, crucially, you integrate it, connect it to what you already know, which is stored in your long-term memory.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty natural way to process information. Find the key stuff, put it in order, and see how it fits with what I already know.
Right. And the organize and integrate parts are really where the active generative learning happens. You're actively building those connections, making meaning.
Got it.
The SOI framework also reminds us that our mental notepad, our working memory, has limited space, which is a key constraint.
Right cognitive load.
Exactly. And that our motivation and our ability to think about our own thinking, what we call metacognition, are also crucial for successful learning using this process.
Okay, so that's SOI. And the other framework you mentioned, ICP. What's that all about?
That's the interactive, constructive, active, passive framework. Chi and Wiley put this forward.
I see, epic.
ICP looks at what the learner is actually doing, their overt behavior, as a kind of clue to how deeply they're engaging with the material.
So judging engagement by actions.
Kind of. It suggests a sort of ladder of engagement. At the bottom is passive, just listening or watching, maybe rereading.
Lowest level.
Then there's active, like highlighting or copying notes verbatim, doing something, but maybe not deeply processing.
Okay, a bit better.
Higher up is constructive. This is where you're generating your own ideas, like explaining something in your own words, drawing a diagram, summarizing. You're building something new internally.
Constructive. That sounds like the generative part again.
Exactly. And at the very top is interactive, where you're actively discussing and working with others on the material, like in a debate or collaborative problem solving.
So the more I'm actively involved in interacting, the more I'm likely to learn, according to IC.
Generally, yes, that's the hierarchy it proposes. Yeah. And it's interesting to note, like you just did, that the constructive level in ICAP, where you're building meaning and making connections yourself, really lines up with the idea of generative processing in the SOI framework.
So both frameworks point to the power of active engagement, of doing something beyond just passively taking it in.
Absolutely. They both converge on that core idea.
Okay, so we have these frameworks, SOI and ICAP, that tell us that actively engaging with learning material is key. But Fiorella suggests they don't tell the whole story, right? There's a limitation.
That's right. While SOI and ICAP are really helpful for understanding the differences between different categories of learning activities, like why actively trying to explain something, constructive generative, is generally better than just passively reading, passive. They don't really get into the details of what's happening within those active or constructive categories.
What do you mean by that, within the categories?
Well, they don't really explain how different types of generative learning activities, for example, explaining something verbally versus creating a visual diagram, both are constructive or generative, might contribute differently to our understanding.
Okay, so they group activities together, but don't distinguish much within the group.
Right, or how these different activities interact with different kinds of learning materials, like, is drawing always better than explaining, or does it depend on whether you're learning from a text versus a video?
Yeah, good point.
We're kind of missing a clear picture of the specific ways these different active learning approaches work and why one might be better than another in a particular situation.
So these frameworks give us a broad understanding that active learning is good, but not the nitty-gritty specifics of which active learning methods are best for what and why.
Exactly. And that's the gap that Fiorella aims to fill with his new way of looking at things, the generative sense-making framework.
All right, so tell us about this new framework. What does it add to the picture? How does it go deeper?
So, Fiorella developed this framework specifically to understand how we make sense of more conceptual material, the kind of stuff you find in science and math, for example.
Okay, focus on conceptual understanding.
Yeah, and he emphasizes that it definitely builds on the ideas of SOI and ICP. It doesn't throw them out, but it goes deeper by looking at the specific types of mental and external representations we use when we learn.
Representations, like pictures in our head or notes.
Kind of, yeah. Internal mental models or external things like diagrams or gestures. The framework is built on three core ideas or assumptions.
Okay, what are they?
The first is that when we're trying to make sense of something, we're primarily using three different modes, he calls them. Explaining, visualizing, and enacting.
Explaining, visualizing, and acting.
Explaining involves generating coherent verbal descriptions, talking it through, writing it out. Visualizing involves creating coherent mental or external visual representations, picturing it, drawing it. And enacting involves generating coherent motor movements, either physical or imagined gesturing, manipulating, mentally simulating movement.
Right. And these three modes are really rooted in the existing research on GLAs we talked about, and they're also commonly looked at in science and math education research.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. We often try to understand things by talking them through, picturing them, or even physically interacting with them or imagining that interaction.
Absolutely. The second core idea is that each of these modes has a primary, unique function in sense-making.
Okay, different jobs for each mode.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Explaining, the framework proposes, primarily helps us generalize our knowledge to take what we've learned and apply it flexibly to new situations.
Generalize. Got it.
Visualizing primarily helps us organize our knowledge conceptually to see the structure, the relationships between different ideas, the big picture spatially.
Organize. Okay.
And enacting primarily helps us simulate knowledge dynamically to understand how things change, how processes unfold, how to perform procedures.
Simulate.
Right.
So like,
So analyze, organize, simulate.
yeah. And these functions are really supported by research in areas like GLAs, multimedia learning, and even what's called embodied cognition, the idea that our thinking is deeply connected to our physical experiences and actions.
So explaining helps me see the bigger picture application. Visualizing helps me see how the pieces fit together, and enacting helps me understand how things work in motion or practice.
Exactly, you've got it. And that leads directly to the third core idea, which Fiorella calls grounded sense-making.
Grounded sense-making. Okay, what's that?
This is the idea that our ability to explain things effectively, that ability to generalize, is actually built upon or grounded in our ability to visualize and enact those concepts.
So visualizing and enacting are foundational for good explaining.
That's the proposal. These two modes, visualizing and enacting, really lay the groundwork, provide the concrete foundation for our ability to form those broader, more abstract understandings that we articulate through explanation.
So to really be able to explain something well, I first need to be able to picture it in my mind, maybe see the structure, and perhaps even imagine myself interacting with it or how it moves.
That's the key idea. This connects really nicely with theories of embodied and grounded cognition, which suggests that our understanding isn't just abstract symbols in our heads, it's deeply tied to our sensory and motor experiences.
Right, thinking isn't separate from the body.
Exactly. And research also supports the idea that being able to internally visualize and enact abstract concepts is crucial for really grasping them, especially in fields like science and math.
Okay, so we have these three modes, explaining, visualizing, and enacting, each with its own primary role, and they all work together, with visualizing and enacting supporting our ability to explain and generalize. Let's dive a bit deeper into each of these modes and some of the specific GLAs that fall under them. Let's start with explaining GLAs. What are those all about again?
Right, so explaining GLAs are activities where you actively generate verbal statements, either out loud or written down, to clarify something or justify your reasoning while you're learning.
Talking it through.
Yeah. The most common example is self-explaining, where you're essentially talking yourself through the material, asking yourself why questions, trying to make sense of it step by step.
Okay.
Another is learning by teaching, like we mentioned, trying to explain the concepts as if you were instructing someone else. That forces you to organize it clearly.
Right.
Even comparing different ideas or making predictions about what might happen next can fall into this category because you often have to articulate your reasoning.
So it's about putting the concepts into my own words in a way that makes sense to me or could make sense to someone else. It's an active articulation process.
Precisely. And as we said, research suggests that the main cognitive benefit of explaining is that it helps us generalize our knowledge.
Apply it more broadly.
Yes. When we explain something, we're actively forging links between the new information and what we already know in a way that makes that knowledge more flexible and transferable. The key here, though, is that you need to really transform the material, wrestle with it, rephrase it in your own terms, integrate it, not just repeat or paraphrase what you've heard or read.
Got it. It's not about just parroting information back. It's about real processing and articulation to build those connections. Now, what about visualizing GLAs?
Visualizing GLAs involve creating coherent visual representations, either externally, like actually drawing a diagram or a map, or internally, just in your mind's eye.
Okay, drawing or picturing.
Yeah. This includes things like sketching out ideas, creating mind maps or concept maps to show how different pieces of information relate, flowcharts, timelines, and even just forming detailed mental images of the concepts.
So anything that helps me see the information in a structured visual way.
Exactly, and there's a good amount of research suggesting that visuals can often be more effective than just words for certain kinds of information because they can organize complex information spatially, making relationships clearer.
Right. A picture is worth 1,000 words sometime.
Kind of, yeah. For example, a simple diagram can immediately show you the relationships between different parts of a system, which might take paragraphs to describe. And crucially, when you actively create these visuals yourself, you're forced to select key information, think about the structure, and use your existing knowledge to translate the information into that visual format.
So it forces organization.
Right. It's not just about passively looking at a picture someone else made. It's about actively constructing a visual representation in your mind or on paper using your prior knowledge.
Okay, so visualizing helps me see the structure and the connections between different parts of the information, helps me organize it. How does enacting fit into this? What are enacting GLAs?
Enacting GLAs involve generating coherent movements, either actual physical movements or imagined ones, to simulate actions or represent dynamic relationships. It's about bringing the motor system into play.
Motor system, like moving.
Yeah, this could be something like using hand gestures while you explain a concept. You know how people naturally do that.
Totally. I'm probably doing it right now.
Exactly. Or physically manipulating objects, like using blocks to represent fractions or acting out a historical event.
Yeah.
Or even just vividly imagining yourself performing a process, like mentally walking through the steps of tying a knot.
So it's about engaging my body or my sense of movement, physically or mentally, in the learning process.
Yes. And this taps into that idea of embodied cognition again. There's a whole area of research suggesting our thinking is actually deeply connected to our physical experiences and our motor capabilities. Our motor system seems to play a role in how we understand and represent concepts, especially those involving action, space, or dynamics.
So the way we move relates to how we think.
It seems so. For example, the way we naturally use our hands when we talk often reflects how we're mentally simulating the concepts we're discussing. Enacting helps us to really feel and simulate the spatial, temporal, and motor elements of what we're learning, grounding the abstract concepts.
Okay, so we've got explaining for generalizing, visualizing for organizing, and enacting for simulating. Now, how do these all work together according to the framework? How do visualizing and enacting actually help us with explaining? You said they ground it.
This is really the core of that grounded sense-making idea. The framework suggests that how well we can explain something, how well we can generalize, really depends on how well we can visualize and enact it.
The quality of the explanation relies on the other two.
In many cases, yes. If you can form a clear mental picture of something, see its structure, and maybe even simulate how it works or changes, you're going to be much better equipped to explain the underlying principles clearly and accurately. Think back to that bicycle pump example people often use. If you can picture the piston moving, the valve opening and closing, the air being compressed,
Right, visualize and maybe even simulate the pumping action mentally.
then you'll be much better at explaining the mechanics of how it works and why it inflates the tire.
That makes total sense. If I can't picture how something works or imagine the steps, I'm going to have a hard time explaining it coherently to someone else. My explanation will be shaky.
Exactly. And the research backs this up. Studies have shown that when learners have access to well-designed visual aids, or importantly, when they're prompted to create their own visualizations while they're learning and explaining, their explanations tend to be more detailed, more inferential, and more insightful.
So the visual helps structure the explanation.
Right. And similarly, engaging in enacting activities like using specific meaningful gestures when you're explaining a concept or manipulating physical models can also lead to better understanding and better explanations, especially for information that's dynamic, procedural, or spatial in nature.
Okay, so providing that visual and kinesthetic support, either through the learning materials themselves or by encouraging us to use visualizing and enacting GLAs, can really boost the quality of our explanations and ultimately our understanding.
Precisely. And interestingly, the framework also suggests the relationship goes both ways to some extent. How effective visualizing and enacting GLAs are might depend on whether they lead to good internal explanations.
How so?
Well, you could just blindly copy a diagram or wiggle your hands without really thinking about it. But if you're drawing a diagram and internally explaining to yourself what each part represents and how it connects, Or if you're gesturing while trying to articulate the underlying concept, that's likely when those activities are most beneficial. You need that explanatory piece.
So the goal isn't just to draw or gesture, it's to use drawing or gesturing to help you explain and understand.
Exactly. It seems that prompting ourselves or being prompted to explain things is probably beneficial across many different learning contexts. And a key goal when we're designing learning experiences, or even just learning on our own, should be to find ways to effectively visualize and enact the information to ultimately improve our explanations and our deeper, generalizable understanding.
That clarifies the interplay really well. So what does the specific research actually show about how visualizing helps us explain things? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Absolutely. There's some really compelling research in this area. For example, a study by Ainsworth and Loiseau back in 2003 looked at college students learning about the human circulatory system.
It's a classic biology topic.
Right. They found that students who were asked to self-explain diagrams of the system developed more detailed understandings and could make more inferences compared to students who were just asked to explain text descriptions of the same system.
So the diagram made a difference in the explanation quality.
It seemed to. The diagrams provided that visual structure that helped them organize their thinking and generate better explanations. Another study by Butcher a few years later built on this. She found something similar, but also showed that diagrams focusing on the main concepts, the functional relationships, were more helpful for understanding than diagrams that just had a lot of extra irrelevant visual detail.
So a good, clear visual helps to focus the explanation on what's actually important rather than distracting details.
Exactly. And then there's research on learner-generated visuals. A 2016 study by Bobek and Tversky found that students who were asked to create their own drawings while learning from text, they looked at how a tire pump works and also chemical bonds, showed better comprehension afterward than students who just wrote summaries of the text.
So making the drawing themselves was better than just writing.
In that context, yes. The act of generating the visual representation seemed to push them to process the information more deeply and organize it. And Fiorella and Kuhlman's 2020 research took this even further. They looked at students learning about the respiratory system.
Another biology example.
Yep. They found that students who were prompted to draw diagrams while they were simultaneously explaining the system learned more effectively than students who only drew or only explained.
So doing both together was particularly powerful.
It really seems like combining these two modes, visualizing through drawing and verbalizing through explaining, can be really synergistic.
It definitely sounds like it. Now, what about that debate you mentioned earlier, whether it's better to be given visuals by the teacher or textbook versus creating your own? What does the research say there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and frankly complex question, and the research is still evolving, with sometimes mixed findings. On one hand, being given accurate, well-designed visuals can certainly be helpful, especially for complex topics or for learners who might struggle to create good visuals themselves.
Sure, a good diagram can save a lot of confusion.
Definitely. But on the other hand, some research, like a study Fiorella did in 2022, suggests that relying solely on provided visuals might sometimes act like a crutch. It might prevent us from engaging in that deeper internal processing needed to build our own robust mental model and potentially hinder our ability to transfer that learning to new, slightly different situations.
So the provided visual might make it too easy, in a way.
Possibly, yes. It might reduce the need for that effortful generative processing. Plus, creating your own visuals, while potentially very beneficial, can also be quite challenging, right? It demands cognitive resources, some level of drawing skill maybe, and learners might struggle to produce accurate or helpful representations without some guidance.
Yeah, I can imagine drawing a really confusing diagram if I'm not sure what I'm doing.
Exactly. So where does that leave us? Some studies, like those by Zhang and Fiorella, and also earlier work by Van Meter, suggest that a really effective approach might be a combination. Perhaps have learners first attempt to generate their own visuals, to grapple with the material themselves.
Do a hard work first.
Right, and then provide them with well-designed visuals, maybe expert-created ones, as a form of feedback or comparison. This way, they get the benefit of the active generation process, but also get to see a correct or expert model to refine their understanding.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like trying to solve a math problem on your own before looking at the work solution. You probably learn more from seeing the correct approach after you've wrestled with it yourself and identified your own gaps.
Precisely. That comparison process can be very powerful.
Okay, that gives us a good picture of visualizing and explaining. Now, what about the evidence for how enacting helps us with explaining? You mentioned gestures and manipulatives.
Right. There's also good evidence for the role of enactment. Researchers like Susan Golden Meadow and her colleagues have done fascinating work looking at how gestures can help children understand and explain mathematical concepts, like the tricky idea of mathematical equivalence, understanding the equal sign.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one for kids.
It is. Their work suggests that the gestures children spontaneously produce often reflect their emerging, sometimes not yet fully verbalized, understanding of the problem. These gestures can act like an internal simulation of the concepts and can actually help them to construct better explanations.
So the hands figure out before the mouth does, sometimes.
In a way, yes. Or at least they work together. For example, they found that teaching children specific gestures to represent mathematical operations, like a V shape with the hand to show grouping terms on one side of an equation, could help them verbalize the underlying strategies more effectively and improve their problem solving.
So the physical movement can really help to solidify those abstract ideas and make them easier to talk about.
Exactly. It grounds the abstraction. And it's not just kids. A 2015 study by Nathan and Martinez looked at college students learning from a science text. They found that students tended to gesture more when they were answering questions that required them to make inferences, to go beyond the literal text.
Suggesting gestures are linked to deeper processing.
It seems so. And interestingly, they also found that when they experimentally prevented students from gesturing while answering questions, it actually reduced the number of correct inferences they made, particularly when learning from text alone without diagrams.
Wow, so stopping the gesturing actually hurt their understanding.
It appeared to, yeah, highlighting the functional role of gestures in that deeper sense-making process. And then there's research on physical manipulatives. A 2021 study by Lafay and colleagues looked at French elementary school students.
Yeah.
They showed that third-grade students who used physical manipulatives like blocks or tokens to solve word problems developed more accurate problem-solving strategies and were able to provide better verbal explanations for their solutions compared to students who only used paper and pencil.
So interacting with the objects help them think and explain.
Yes. However, interestingly, they also found that this benefit was less pronounced or even absent for fifth-grade students studying the same problems.
Oh, why would that be?
Well, it might suggest that the effectiveness of concrete enactment, like using manipulatives, might depend on the learner's developmental stage, their prior knowledge, or maybe how abstract their existing understanding already is. Older students might have already internalized the concepts and not need the physical objects as much.
So it's again about matching the strategy to the learner and the context. But the general idea holds. Whether it's a simple gesture or physically manipulating objects, that physical engagement seems to ground the learning and often leads to better explanations.
That seems to be the case, yes.
We've talked a lot about explaining, visualizing, and enacting GLAs. What about the role of worked examples in all of this? You mentioned them briefly with SOI. How do they fit into Fiorella's framework?
Yeah, examples are really interesting because they inherently provide a degree of visualizing and enacting support simply by showing abstract principles or procedures in a concrete step-by-step way. You can see the steps, visualizing, and mentally simulate carrying them out, enacting.
Okay, so examples themselves are a form of support.
Exactly. But again, their effectiveness, according to this framework and related research, really comes down to whether they promote that crucial explaining mode of learning. Are learners just passively following along, or are they actively trying to understand the why behind the steps?
Ah, the self-explanation piece again?
Precisely. Research by Renkel and others has consistently shown that when learners study worked examples where they're shown step by step how to solve a problem, they learn most effectively when they actively try to explain the underlying principles or rationale behind each step. This is often called the principle-based self-explanation.
Not just what step, but why that step.
Exactly. And studies, like one by Atkinson and colleagues, have shown that specifically prompting learners to generate these principle-based self-explanations while studying worked examples significantly improves their ability to transfer that knowledge to solve new, different problems later on.
So it's not enough to just look at a solved problem. I need to actively try to figure out why each step is the way it is to really learn from it.
Precisely. That's the generative part. And the way the examples themselves are designed can also make a big difference in facilitating this. For instance, research by Bone back in the 90s showed that visually grouping related steps in a worked example, like putting a box around steps that achieve a specific subgoal, helped learners to organize the information more effectively and generate better explanations of the overall solution process.
So the visual design of the example matters for explaining.
Yes, it provides visual organization support. Similarly, comparing multiple examples that illustrate the same underlying principle but differ in surface features is another powerful technique. Research by people like Holyoake and Riddle Johnson suggests this comparison process helps learners abstract the core principle.
Seeing the same idea in different contexts helps you generalize.
Exactly. But learners don't always spontaneously compare examples effectively. Often they need to be prompted to look for the similarities and differences and to explain why those similarities and differences are important. A classic study by Gentner and colleagues in 2003, for example, found that prompting learners to compare different case studies of negotiation strategies significantly improved their ability to transfer those strategies to new negotiation scenarios.
So prompting the explanation of the comparison is key.
It seems to be yes. The examples provide the raw material, but the explaining brings the learning home.
Okay, so we're starting to build a really strong picture of how explaining is central and how visualizing and acting, often supported by things like diagrams and examples, really pave the way for better explaining and deeper understanding. But as Fiorella points out, and as we've touched on, it's not always a smooth path. What are some of the main things that can get in the way of this kind of sense-making? Why aren't these generative learning activities always effective in practice?
Yeah, that's crucial to understand. There are several potential roadblocks, which Fiorella groups into three main categories: cognitive barriers, metacognitive barriers, and motivational barriers.
Okay, cognitive, metacognitive, motivational. Let's start with cognitive barriers. What falls under that?
On the cognitive side, one key barrier we've already hinted at is having insufficient background knowledge. If you simply don't have a basic conceptual foundation in the topic, even the best GLA might just be overwhelming or confusing. You need something to connect the new information to.
Right, you can't generate connections if there's nothing there to connect to.
Exactly. However, it's interesting some research suggests that learners with relatively less prior knowledge, but still some foundation, can sometimes benefit more from certain GLAs than experts, perhaps because the GLA forces them to build connections that experts already have. It seems there might be a sort of sweet spot or threshold.
So you need a certain level of existing knowledge for these activities to really take hold and be productive.
Exactly. That idea is sometimes referred to as the knowledge threshold hypothesis. Another major cognitive barrier is the limited capacity of our working memory, that mental space where we actively process information right now.
Cognitive load again.
Right. Some GLAs, like maybe elaborate drawing from complex texts or trying to self-explain something very intricate, can be quite demanding on working memory. This might explain why certain activities are less effective for younger learners, as Broad's research suggested, as their working memory capacity might be lower.
Or just for anyone learning something really complex for the first time.
Absolutely. Also, our individual differences in basic cognitive abilities, like our spatial reasoning skills, can influence how effective we are at certain GLAs. Someone with high spatial ability might find drawing or mental visualization easier and more beneficial. And finally, a huge cognitive barrier can simply be poor instructional design. If the way the learning material is presented creates unnecessary mental overload, what Sweller and others call extraneous cognitive load, like having confusing layouts, irrelevant pictures, or requiring students to split their attention that can consume working memory resources and leave little capacity for the effortful generative processing needed for sense-making.
So if the material itself is poorly designed or just way too much to handle at once, it basically sabotages your ability to effectively explain, visualize, and enact.
Pretty much, yeah, it swamps the system.
Okay, those are the cognitive barriers. What about those metacognitive barriers you mentioned? What does that involve?
Metacognitive barriers relate to our awareness and control of our own learning processes. How well do we understand how learning works? And how well can we manage our own learning?
Thinking about thinking.
Exactly. And one significant barrier here is that many learners simply don't spontaneously use these effective generative learning activities when they're studying on their own. Research across different domains, learning from texts, from visuals, from examples, problem solving consistently shows that students often default to less effective, more passive strategies like rereading their notes or just looking over examples without really engaging deeply.
We tend to do what feels easiest, maybe.
Often, yes, or just what we've always done.
Uh,
Even simple things like taking effective notes, Fiorella and Mayer found many students just copy things down verbatim instead of summarizing or organizing.
right.
And even when learners are prompted or told to use GLAs, they might struggle with how to do it effectively. They might lack the strategic knowledge. How do you plan, monitor, and regulate your performance? What does a good self-explanation actually sound like? How detailed should my drawing be? Generic prompts like, explain this, aren't always enough. Often more specific guidance or scaffolding is needed.
So knowing you should explain isn't the same as knowing how to explain well.
Exactly, and the quality matters. Research consistently shows that the quality of the GLA output, the depth of the explanation, the accuracy of the drawing, the appropriateness of the gesture predicts learning outcomes much better than just whether the activity was performed or not.
Makes sense. A bad explanation doesn't help much.
Right. And coordinating multiple representations, like text and diagrams, can also be metacognitively challenging. And perhaps one of the biggest metacognitive barriers is the failure to transfer the use of GLAs to new situations. Students might learn to self-explain effectively in one specific class or context with prompting, but then they don't apply that strategy when they're studying for a different class on their own.
So the learning strategy doesn't stick or generalize.
Often not, unfortunately. We can get stuck in our old, less effective but comfortable study habits like rereading or cramming, even if we've been shown better ways. Fiorella mentions research by Bjork, Dunlosky, and others on these kinds of illusions of competence where ineffective strategies feel productive.
So it's not just about knowing about these strategies. It's about knowing how to use them effectively, monitoring their use, and actually choosing to use them consistently in different situations. That's a tall order.
It really is. And that leads us nicely into the third category, motivational barriers.
Okay, motivation. How does that block sense-making?
Motivational barriers involve our beliefs, values, goals, and interests related to learning and specific learning strategies. Basically, do we want to put in the effort required for these often more demanding GLAs?
Right, they sound like more work than just rereading.
They often are. So our beliefs about our own ability to use GLAs successfully, our self-efficacy, play a big role. If you don't believe you can draw a helpful diagram or that you're capable of explaining a concept clearly, you're less likely to even try.
Yeah, fear of failure or looking silly.
Could be. Also, our perception of the value of the GLA matters. Do we actually believe that taking the time to self-explain or draw will lead to better understanding and better grades? Or does it just feel like a waste of time compared to just trying to memorize facts?
The perceived utility.
Exactly. And then there's the perceived cost. How much effort, time, and mental energy do we think the GLA will require? We often weigh these factors, consciously or unconsciously. There's a growing area of research looking specifically at this strategy-based motivation, as Shukaslo and colleagues call it.
Motivation for the strategy itself, not just the topic.
Right. For example, some research suggests students might be less motivated to use drawing as a strategy if they find it effortful or don't see its value, even if it could potentially help them learn. People might have preferences, maybe preferring verbal activities over visual ones, or just generally opting for strategies that feel less effortful, even if they are ultimately less effective for long-term learning.
So even if I intellectually know a GLA, like self-explaining is a good idea, if I don't believe I can do it well, or I don't think it's worth the effort, or I just don't feel like putting in that work right now, I probably won't bother.
That's often the reality, yes. These motivational factors can be powerful barriers.
Wow, okay. So cognitive limits. Not knowing how to manage the process effectively and just not being motivated enough, lots of potential pitfalls. So how can instructors, or even we ourselves as independent learners, try to overcome these barriers and effectively guide the use of GLAs to make them more consistently beneficial?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Fiorella emphasizes the importance of adapting and tailoring both the learning materials themselves and the specific support provided for GLAs. This adaptation should be based on the learner's current level of knowledge, their cognitive abilities, and also their beliefs and motivations related to learning.
So personalize the approach as much as possible.
Ideally, yes. He also suggests that educators should view the products of GLAs, the explanations, drawings, concept maps, learners create not just as learning activities, but as valuable formative assessment tools. They offer a window into the student's current understanding and misconceptions.
Use the GLA output to see where they're at.
Exactly, and then use that information to adjust instruction or provide more targeted support. It becomes a feedback loop.
Okay, that makes sense. What are some specific ways Fiorella suggests we can guide the use of GLAs? He mentioned support strategies.
Yes, he outlines several key approaches to providing GLA support, often presented in a kind of sequence from more explicit help to more independence. First, there's explicit instruction.
Okay, what does that involve?
This means directly explaining and demonstrating how to select and carry out specific GLAs effectively, often using concrete examples. So an instructor might model aloud how they would self-explain a worked example, thinking through the steps and the reasons. Or they might show step by step how to create a concept map from a reading passage, explaining their choices along the way.
So making the thinking process visible, showing them the ropes, basically.
Exactly. The goal here is to make the process clearer, reduce the initial cognitive load of figuring out what to do, provide that crucial strategic knowledge, and hopefully build the learner's confidence, their self-efficacy in using the strategy.
Makes sense. Start by showing them how. What's another way to guide GLA use, maybe the next step?
The next level of support is often referred to as scaffolded practice. This involves giving more specific prompts, hints, or partial structures to guide learners as they are actively trying to use a GLA themselves.
Like training wheels.
Kind of, yeah. So, for self-explaining, instead of just saying, explain this, a scaffold might be providing targeted questions that encourage them to focus on specific causal relationships or compare different concepts. For drawing or mapping, a scaffold could involve giving them a partially completed diagram or graphic organizer to fill in the rest.
Okay, so giving them a starting point or guiding questions.
Right. The idea is to reduce the initial cognitive demands, keep them from getting completely stuck, and help focus their attention on the most important aspects of the task without doing all the work for them. Another related technique here is called concreteness fading, where you might start learners with very concrete examples or physical manipulatives, high scaffolding, and then gradually transition them towards more abstract representations or problems as their understanding develops, fading the scaffold.
So providing just enough support to get them started and keep them moving in the right direction, then gradually removing that support. And what's the third approach? Where does this lead?
The third broad approach is independent practice. This involves giving learners repeated opportunities to select and use GLAs on their own across different topics and contexts, ideally with decreasing levels of scaffolding over time.
Okay, letting them fly solo eventually.
That's the goal. Practice is absolutely crucial for making the use of these cognitive strategies more fluent, more automatic, and ultimately integrating them into their regular learning habits. It takes time and repetition.
Practice makes perfect, or at least proficient.
Exactly. But even during this independent practice phase, it's still important to provide access to models of good strategy use, offer scaffolding if they get stuck, and crucially, provide feedback on their efforts. Learners can also benefit from metacognitive tools like creating if-then plans, also known as implementation intentions. If I am studying my biology notes, then I will try to draw a diagram of the process. This helps bridge the gap between knowing a strategy and actually using it. The ultimate aim is habit formation.
Right, making it a habit makes it stick. You also mentioned the importance of feedback multiple times now. How does that tie specifically into guiding GLAs effectively?
Feedback is absolutely essential, especially after learners have engaged in these generative activities where they might make errors or have incomplete understanding. Effective feedback helps them to see the gap between their current understanding, as revealed by their explanation or drawing, and a more accurate or complete understanding.
It highlights the errors or gaps.
Yes. In the context of GLAs, feedback could take many forms. It might involve providing correct explanations, showing expert-created visual representations for comparison, or even demonstrating the correct way to enact a procedure or use a gesture. It essentially provides a model of the target understanding.
Okay, giving them the correct version to compare against.
Right. However, it's important to remember that simply giving feedback isn't always enough. Learners might not notice the discrepancy between their work and the feedback, or they might not know how to use the feedback to revise their understanding.
So just giving the answer isn't enough.
Often not. Instructors, or even peers in some cases, can play a crucial role here by explicitly pointing out specific errors, maybe using contrasting examples or visuals to illustrate the feedback clearly, prompting learners to reflect on why their initial attempt was incorrect, and providing opportunities for discussion and revision based on the feedback. Learning from mistakes, when guided effectively, is itself a very powerful generative process.
So feedback isn't just about saying right or wrong, it's about guiding learners to understand why they might have gone wrong and how to bridge that gap using the error as a learning opportunity.
Exactly, that's the ideal.
Now, another really interesting point Fiorella brings up, which adds another layer of complexity and nuance, is the timing of when these GLAs are used. It's not just what we do or how we support it, but when we do it, that matters too, right?
Exactly. Timing is critical. Traditionally, GLAs, like summarizing or self-explaining, have often been thought of as activities to do during instruction while you're actively engaging with the new learning materials, reading the chapter, watching the lecture.
Right, processing it as it comes in.
Yes. But more recent research, including work related to retrieval practice and productive failure, has explored the unique benefits of strategically using GLAs before instruction even begins or after instruction is completed as ways to prepare for or consolidate learning.
Okay, let's unpack that. First, using GLAs as preparatory activities before any formal teaching of the new material. What's the thinking behind that? Why would you do something before you've learned it?
It sounds counterintuitive, maybe, but the idea is that doing certain generative activities before instruction can help activate relevant prior knowledge, expose potential misconceptions, and generally get your brain ready to better understand and integrate the upcoming information when it is presented.
Priming the pump? Sort of.
Exactly. For example, there's a body of research on productive failure championed by Manu Kapoor and others. This suggests that having learners try to solve challenging problems related to a topic before they've been formally taught the methods or solutions can actually lead to deeper conceptual understanding when they are eventually taught the canonical solutions.
So struggling first makes the later explanation stick better.
That's the idea. The initial struggle helps them appreciate the structure of the problem and the need for the solution when it arrives. Similarly, asking learners to make predictions about a topic before they learn about it, what do you think will happen if, can pique their curiosity and prime them to pay closer attention to information that confirm or contradicts their initial ideas, leading to better encoding.
Get them invested.
Right. Even doing some physical enactment related to the topic before instruction, like using relevant gestures, might activate useful motor representations in the brain that can support later learning. However, research also suggests that preparatory activities seem most effective when they really get you thinking and generating ideas or potential solutions, rather than activities that just involve recalling specific, isolated facts, like simple pre-testing on definitions.
So it's about getting the mental wheels turning in a meaningful way, creating a time for telling, and preparing the brain to connect with the new information when it comes. Okay, that's the before. What about using GLAs as retrieval activities after you've already been taught something? What's the benefit there?
This connects strongly with the large body of research on the testing effect, or retrieval practice. The core idea is that actively trying to retrieve information from memory after some delay is a very powerful way to strengthen and consolidate that memory, much more effective than simply rereading the material.
Right, pulling it out makes it stronger.
Exactly. And using GLAs as the method of retrieval, for instance, trying to explain a concept from memory without looking at your notes, or drawing a diagram of a process from scratch can be particularly beneficial. These activities don't just strengthen the memory trace, they also encourage you to reprocess the information, organize it, identify gaps, and potentially generate new inferences. Activities that encourage elaboration and explanation during retrieval seem particularly good for promoting deeper understanding and transfer.
So it's about reinforcing the learning and potentially deepening it by actively pulling it back out of your memory using these generative methods.
Yes. However, a key caveat here is that these retrieval-based GLAs obviously depend on you being able to successfully retrieve something in the first place. If you try to explain a concept and just draw a complete blank.
Yeah, that's not very productive.
Right. In those cases, retrieval fails, and you probably need some feedback, hints, or a chance to restudy the material before trying retrieval again. It's about finding that sweet spot of desirable difficulty.
Makes sense. Now, Fiorella also mentions the idea of using GLAs during instruction as a form of retrieval practice. How does that work?
Yes, that's an interesting and increasingly researched area, sort of interleaving brief retrieval-based GLAs within the main instructional flow. Instead of one big retrieval session at the end, you break it up.
Like mini quizzes or explanation breaks during a lecture.
Exactly. Some studies have found benefits of weaving in brief generative activities at strategic points during a lesson. For example, after students watch a short video segment or read a section of text, you might pause and ask them to orally explain the key concept to a partner, or quickly sketch a diagram summarizing what they just learned before moving on to the next segment.
So process and retrieve as you go.
Right. This not only helps them retrieve and process that chunk of information, potentially strengthening it, but it can also serve as a check for understanding and prepare them cognitively for the next part of the lesson. There's still some ongoing discussion and research comparing the effectiveness of doing these activities during versus after instruction for different learning goals, like initial encoding versus long-term retention. And it likely depends on factors like the complexity and cohesion of the material itself.
Okay, so the optimal placement might vary.
It might. But the main point is that there's value in thinking about how we can strategically incorporate GLAs throughout the entire learning process before, during, and after, not just confining them to one particular phase.
That really broadens the perspective on when and how to use these powerful techniques. Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground here. The three modes of sense-making, explaining, visualizing, and acting, how they support each other, the potential cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational barriers to using GLAs effectively, how to guide their use through instruction, scaffolding, practice, and feedback, and even the crucial aspect of timing when to use them. Pulling it all together, what are the main takeaways from Fiorella's generative sense-making framework for how we should think about learning and teaching?
I think for how we think about learning itself, this framework really helps us to understand in more detail the cognitive processes that are involved in building deep, meaningful, and flexible understanding, especially for complex concepts. It moves beyond just saying active learning is good.
Right, it gives us more specifics.
Exactly. It emphasizes the interconnected roles of explaining for generalization, visualizing for organization, and enacting for simulation, and critically, how they support each other, with explaining often being grounded in the other two. It suggests that all those different generative learning activities we talked about, summarizing, drawing, gesturing, self-testing, teaching, can ultimately be seen as ways to support this fundamental process of generalization by grounding our understanding in those more concrete visual and motor representations.
So it provides a unifying lens for understanding why different active strategies might work. And what about for how we teach? How can educators practically use this framework to improve their approaches in the classroom or into designing learning materials?
For educators, I think the framework provides a strong theoretical rationale for why actively engaging students in the learning process using GLAs can be so powerful when implemented thoughtfully. It encourages moving beyond just delivering information.
Right, towards facilitating sense-making.
Precisely. It also underscores the critical need for educators to be aware of those potential cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational challenges students might face when asked to use these activities. You can't just assign, draw a concept map, and expect magic to happen.
You need to provide support.
Yes, educators need to think carefully about how they design their materials. Are they clear? Do they minimize extraneous load? And their classroom activities to appropriately encourage and support students to explain, visualize, and enact the concepts they're learning. They should also seriously consider using the products of these activities, like student explanations, diagrams, or even observing gestures, as valuable formative assessment insights into student thinking, and use that information to adapt their teaching in real time.
Use the GLAs to guide instruction.
Exactly. And finally, educators should think strategically about when to introduce these different activities, maybe using some for preparation, others during learning, and others for retrieval and consolidation to maximize their impact on learning over time.
So it's not just about throwing in a few random active learning exercises for variety's sake. It's about really understanding why they work, understanding the underlying cognitive processes of explaining, visualizing, and enacting, and then intentionally designing learning experiences and providing appropriate support and timing to foster those processes effectively.
That's a perfect summary of the practical implication, I think. It's about being intentional and informed in how we foster sense-making.
Given this rich framework, what are some of the big questions or directions that researchers like Fiorella are still exploring? What don't we know yet?
Oh, there are still many exciting avenues for future research. The framework itself generates lots of testable questions. One key area is to really systematically investigate in more detail how different kinds of visual and motor support, whether it's provided in the materials or generated by the learner, specifically influence the quality of learners' explanations and their overall learning outcomes across different domains.
Teasing apart the effects of provided versus generated support.
Right, and how they interact. We need to better understand how the act of explaining might mediate the effectiveness of visualizing and enacting support. We also need much more direct evidence on how those cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational barriers we discussed actually moderate GLA effectiveness in practice. For example, how does the impact of drawing change depending on a learner's prior knowledge or their spatial ability? How does age really affect the utility of different GLAs? We need a better map of the conditions under which specific GLAs are most suitable for different types of learners.
More personalized recommendations.
Ideally, yes. There's also still relatively less research compared to cognitive factors on the specifics of those metacognitive and motivational barriers. Why do students choose not to use effective strategies spontaneously? How can we design instruction to promote not just knowledge of GLAs, but also the metacognitive skill to use them appropriately and the motivation to do so consistently? How can we foster better transfer of these strategies? Long-term training studies looking at the impact of sustained GLA instruction over months or years would be really valuable here.
Building those habits takes time.
It does. And we also need to refine our understanding of the most effective forms and levels of guidance, that scaffolding piece, and how guidance interacts with the timing of GLAs. For instance, how much guidance is optimal during those preparatory productive failure activities? How do we balance retrieval effort and success rates when designing retrieval-based GLAs? More research is also needed on using visualizing and enacting activities specifically as preparatory or retrieval strategies.
Lots to figure out about the how and when of support.
Definitely. And finally, two more quick areas. One is systematically testing how these principles apply in collaborative learning settings. How can groups of learners leverage visualizations and enactments to effectively co-construct explanations and build shared understanding?
Sense making together.
Right. And the other area is exploring the metacognitive benefits of GLAs themselves. How do activities like explaining or drawing not only help learning, but also help learners and instructors become more aware of what they do and don't understand? Can the different modes provide unique cues for judging comprehension accurately and regulating future study? Using GLAs as tools for self-assessment and formative assessment is a really promising direction.
So it sounds like while Fiorella's framework provides a really strong foundation and clarifies a lot about how we learn, there's still a huge amount more to discover about the nuances and the best ways to help ourselves and others truly make sense of new information.
Absolutely. It's a very active and important area of research. This generative sense-making framework provides a really helpful theoretical lens to guide those future investigations and refine our understanding.
Okay, so to wrap things up for you, our listener, we've taken a really deep dive today into Logan Fiorella's generative sense-making framework. We've looked at those three key ways our brains seem to make sense of things: explaining, visualizing, and enacting.
And crucially, how visualizing and enacting can really support and ground our ability to explain concepts clearly and apply them flexibly.
Right. We've also explored the importance of actively engaging with learning through those generative learning activities, or GLAs, while also being really mindful of the potential cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational challenges that can get in the way.
And we talked about how we can strategically guide and time these activities through things like explicit instructions, scaffolding, practice, feedback, and using them before, during, and after learning to maximize their positive impact.
The big message here, really, is that learning isn't just this passive thing where information gets poured into our heads. It requires us to actively engage, to build connections, to, well, generate understanding.
Exactly. And by consciously thinking about how we explain, visualize, and maybe even enact new information, we can really unlock a deeper and more lasting understanding of the world around us.
And on that note, here's a final thought, a little challenge maybe, for you to consider. Think about your own learning habits. The next time you're trying to grasp a really new or complex concept, maybe for work or just out of curiosity, pause and ask yourself, how could I explain this core idea in my own simplest words, maybe to a friend? How could I visualize it, even just a quick, rough sketch on scrap paper or a clear mental image? And is there any way I could physically enact or simulate some part of it, even with just a simple gesture or by mentally walking through the steps?
Try consciously engaging these different modes, perhaps focusing on one you don't normally use. You might be surprised.
Yeah, experiment with consciously activating, explaining, visualizing, and enacting. You might just find that you start to see those tricky puzzle pieces clipping into place more easily and more satisfyingly than ever before.
It's really about taking a more active, intentional, and multimodal role in your own learning journey and recognizing the incredible power of your own mind to make sense of things.